Hello. So last winter, I learned about Akshobya Buddha's vow. He made an amazing vow, which was to never feel anger or disgust towards another being. And he kept that vow. He was unmoved from that vow, and thus he is called the unmovable one. I read that and was amazed. I was like, wow, what a wonderful vow, and so hard to do. My thought was that I would love to be able to take and keep such a vow, but with my afflicted mind, no way I could keep that vow. So I decided to explore what things keep me from being able to keep that vow and to look at what things I can do to work with my mind to work towards a place where someday I can be able to keep such a vow. And I looked at a lot of things that have been taught over and over again to work with anger. And also I looked at things, tried to look at things, played around with looking at things from different angles. And the first obstacle that came to my mind was attachment, actually, and how I think attachment feeds anger. I can, when have strong attachment to objects, possessions, ideas, people, getting my way, my view of myself, and then I find it easy to get anger arising from towards someone who I perceive as threatening that object of attachment or getting in the way of my um, attaining that object of attachment. So I thought about attachment a bit there and trying to work on that some too. Letting go of my attachment goes a long ways in helping me to control anger in situations that involve like small irritations and such about unimportant things of just letting it go. But I'm a long ways from being able to uproot attachment completely, so that's limited in that way. But I do find it helpful to recognize that anger can be based in attachment because it helps strengthen my idea that attachment is a negative mind and that anger is a negative mind. Another thing that comes to mind is the habit of just responding with anger. And anger can be in many levels. It can be, coarse hatred, or it can be irritation, annoyance, defensiveness, and so on. So the substantial cause of anger, as we've been learning, is a previous mind of anger. And which means it's not the situation or the person that we're directing our anger towards. And so that brings me to another obstacle, the third poison, ignorance. Out of ignorance, I conceive of other beings and the outer situation as being the cause of my problem, and even maybe thinking of them as the cause of my response. And ignorance has many levels, and this would fall under ignorance of cause and effect, specifically ignorance of the laws of karma. This view that the problem is external is totally contrary to the third general characteristic of karma, which says if an action is not performed, its results will not be met. Or if you do not perform an action that serves as the cause for a pleasant or unpleasant experience, then you cannot have that experience. And this means that I have created the causes for what I experience, and the external situation and the people involved are at most only presenting conditions for those that effect to be ripened, the causes to produce their effect or the karma to ripen. So habituating my mind to remembering this can help me with counteracting anger. And the thing is to be able to remember in the moment, this is my own karma ripening, and to own it rather than blaming the other person. And so when I'm looking at this level of my own ignorance, I'm trying to focus on how I view a situation and how I view myself and other beings. And this has led me to really trying to understand and internalize the thought that there is no external enemy. And this is something I sat with a lot this summer thinking about, is there is no external enemies. There's no one to blame things on and be angry at. The enemy is internal. It's the mental afflictions. And the idea that there is an external enemy is a huge obstacle to overcoming anger. So through being under the sway of afflictive emotions, I've created the causes to suffer, and I will continue creating causes for suffering as long as I continue to act under the influence of the afflictions. So the afflictions are the internal enemy. Reacting to perceived external enemies with non-virtuous behavior strengthens those internal enemies and causes more suffering. So to get rid of this view that tries to externalize the source of my suffering, I need to repeatedly contemplate the real source of my suffering, which is the afflictions themselves and the actions I take under their influence. And that includes anger, just causes more suffering. And how we look at situations influences how we respond. I came across a quote many years ago in a book, I'm Okay, You're Okay, that said, it is the nature of the child to mistake disappointment for disaster. Well, we think about it, and part of the definition of anger has an exaggeration in it. So I mention this because when I exaggerate situations, I respond in an exaggerated way. And this goes back to the letting it go approach. If it's small, it doesn't matter, like where the spatula goes, let it go. It's not nearly as important as the state of my mind. And I need to be able to recognize how insignificant many things are. I don't have to get in my way for things to be all right. Actually, even in the case of a disaster, it is best to keep a calm mind. If, for instance, a water pipe breaks and I gotta scurry down, go to the valve and shut the water off, why can't I just do that with an unafflicted mind rather than an afflicted mind? Do it with a calm mind. And if someone scolds me for hurrying, there's no sense in getting defensive or angry about it. What good does that do? So the idea that anger is justified or even called for in some situations seems quite prevalent in our society. Actually, I don't think it's ever useful and only causes problems. Because the Buddhist definition of anger involves a level of exaggeration, which is a kind of ignorance. And how useful is that? There are many other strong, motivating mental factors that are virtuous. So I don't really need to resort to an affliction to motivate me. Another approach I've been working with is learning to differentiate between the person and the behavior and not seeing sentient beings as their afflictions. Often when someone is doing something that I perceive as negative, it is because they are under the power of afflictions. Although sometimes it's simply my own perspective that needs some work. But if it is the situation that the other person is overcome by afflictions in that moment, then if I can recognize that, I can learn to see them as a suffering sentient being rather than an enemy. And then I can work with generating compassion towards them instead of anger. And humility is very helpful here. If I can recognize the afflictions when they arise in my own mind, then I can develop an understanding of what the other person is going through and see some commonality between us. Whether the person is acting under the influence of anger, attachment, ignorance, or any other affliction, if I've been watching for a while what arises in my own mind, then I can bring to mind the thought, I know how that feels, and we're not that different. And I find this very helpful, especially when I'm dealing with a person who is experiencing anger. it can bring up the thought that, so that's what I look like when I'm acting that way. And it makes me not want to respond with anger. So I find that can be, for myself, a very strong antidote in the moment. And I think about another thing I toyed with a little bit is thinking of this idea. A lot of times we hear a metaphor of samsara as an ocean. So I've been thinking of all of us sentient beings in samsara, like people treading water in a vast and dirty ocean, and being tossed about by waves and slammed about. And someone slams into me from a wave. It makes no sense for me to get angry at them. We're all being tossed about uncontrollably in this stormy, foul water. What good does it do for me to get angry and yell at them, hey, you splashed me with foul water? It's like kind of ridiculous. Yeah. And also, I've been thinking about identities, attachment to my own identities and the ignorance involved with that, and identities others hold and that I hold in my perception of them. And one thing that came up for me with this is the thought of what's left behind when we die. The body is left behind, but so are all these gross identities of this life. Who we think we are in the context of our likes and dislikes, careers, our place in our close social groups, our place in the greater society, cultural identities, ethnicity, political allegiances, and so on and on and on and on. We have had innumerable past lives, all of which involved some level of these kind of identities. And most of us don't remember any of it now. I certainly don't. And I don't expect to remember any of the identities of this life in my next life. And so I think that way to try to put those in perspective, because of those are a lot of times what we consider what draws us together or divides us. Conventionally, the sum total of those identities kind of makes up who we think we are, but it's simply an imputation. Ultimately, I am not my body, not my gender, not my nationality, my physical abilities, nor my occupation, my political beliefs, any of that. And other sentient beings are not their identities or their current appearances either. Conventionally, there's a lot of difference between Joseph Biden and Donald Trump. And we need to be aware of those when we go to vote. And vote, please vote. But but ultimately, they both want to be happy and avoid suffering, just like me. And ultimately, they're both dealing with confusion and about what is going to bring happiness and what's going to bring suffering, just like I am. Even though I have all these teachings that I have access to, still I'm habituated to certain thoughts about what's going to bring me happiness and what's going to bring me suffering. So in this sense, the differences between sentient beings are superficial and insignificant, while the similarities are very significant. And I try to keep this in mind when I encounter or think about beings who I have difficulty relating to, or whose ideas and actions I find harmful. That is, I try to remember our similarities when I think about people on opposite sides of issues, or people across the aisle, as it's said. And of course, I need to work with my view of other beings using 7-point cause and effect and equalizing and exchanging self and others, these methods of generating bodhicitta. I'm sure that the main cause of Akshobya Buddha being able to not get angry with beings was that he had generated strong bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is such a strong opposite to anger, a supreme guide for engaging in virtue and abandoning non-virtue. But I think these ways of thinking about situations and beings that I have mentioned here can help me deeply engage in these methods to generate bodhicitta. And to overcome anger completely, of course, it must be severed from its root, which is self-grasping ignorance. And I think the part I mentioned here about contemplating identities and their the superficial aspect of them really can help loosen that over time. So I have a lot of work to do in all these areas, but if I engage in the practice taught by the Buddha, I can eventually accomplish the goal. So I had some lines here I wanted to read. Let it go. Keep a calm mind. This is my karma ripening. There is no external enemy. The internal afflictions are the only enemy. That's what I look like when I act that way. I know how that feels. We're not that different. The differences are superficial and the similarities are significant. See their kindness, see their suffering. Develop bodhicitta. Contemplate emptiness for the benefit of each and every sentient being.